Act 2 is the biggest chunk of a screenplay, and for many people, it's the most challenging part to write. So today we're going to talk about some tips and tricks and theory that will help you as you navigate it. I'm Nathan Graham Davis. I'm a Hollywood screenwriter living in Massachusetts, and this is class 12 of Delusional. If this is the first video that you've seen from this series, then congratulations, you have stumbled across a one-of-a-kind 15-week screenwriting course, and you don't have to pay me a thing for it. I make my living as a screenwriter, and I got here largely because of the help of other people, so this is me paying it forward. If you want to know more, go check out Class 0, where you can find out if this is for you. If you've been following along this entire time and doing all the assignments, congratulations for making it this far. You've done a lot of work, and you should be somewhere between 40 and 60 pages into your script at this point, and that's a lot of pages. For many of you, it's already the longest thing you've written in your entire life, so take a second and reflect on what you've accomplished. You're very close to doing something that many people dream of, but most never do, which is writing an entire feature screenplay. If you're around that 50 to 60 page mark, it means you're right in the middle of Act 2. And like I said, many writers think that the second act is the hardest part of a script. And in a way, that's true. It's certainly the biggest part, and we spend so much time figuring out the setup and the end of our movies that we often lose sight of what's going to make up the middle, until we suddenly find that we have to write it. But here's the thing, the middle of the movie is the movie. In Jurassic Park, when they first see the dinosaurs, that's Act 2. The scenes with the T-Rex and the Jeeps, Act 2. The scene in the tree with the dinosaur blowing snot all over them, Act 2. The scene on the electric fence, Act 2. In The Matrix, we don't really get to see what The Matrix is, or, even the real world outside of it, until Act 2. Act 2 is where you show off your concept. As I said in a previous class, many writers think of Act 2 as two parts separated by a midpoint. That midpoint is often a big reversal that also serves as a point of no return. In Act 2A, the protagonist is seemingly making progress toward their goal and maybe even having a little fun while doing it. The midpoint has a direct impact on that progress, and afterward in Act 2B, they find themselves getting beat up more and more. That's the simple version, but we can dive way further into it, and so we will. If you remember from Class 7, one way you can structure your second act is by using theme. So if you're going to do it that way, in the first part of Act 2A, roughly from pages 30 to 45, the protagonist is going after their goal and doing pretty well. But they haven't changed yet, so the actions they're taking are still according to that anti-theme. But then in the second part of Act 2A, from about pages 45 to 60, things start to happen along the way that introduce the theme, and the protagonist gets a glimpse of the truth and their need to change. But then the midpoint happens, and it's often directly related to their flaw and the anti-theme, and as a result, they kind of double down on not changing. They live out that anti-theme in the first part of Act 2B until it leads them to a low point, to rock bottom. Here, they realize the truth of that theme, they embrace it in the end of Act 2, and then they ultimately move into Act 3. And to help you even further, there are useful plot points that writers tend to use in between all those segments. These are not at all exact page numbers that you need to stick to, but as an approximation, they can be a really helpful guide. Around page 45, we get a moment that raises the stakes of the movie even further. This is sometimes referred to as a pinch point. In my head, I often just think of it as the stakes raiser. Around page 60, we get to that midpoint. This is often some kind of twist or moment of no return for the protagonist. It's a major shift in the story. Around page 75, we get to the low point where they hit rock bottom. And then at around page 85, we break into Act 3. Pause the video for a second and open up the 3 scripts we've been using for several recent classes: Get Out, Die Hard, and Littlemisssunshine. Per usual, the links are in the description of the video below. So let's start out by looking at that page 45 beat. The pinch point, the stakes raiser, whatever you want to call it, all you need to remember is that this is a point where the stakes of the movie get bigger. It's not as big of an oh shit moment as the midpoint, but it's still an oh shit moment, and it keeps our characters on their toes. It contributes to their arc, and most importantly, it keeps your audience engaged and on the edge of their seats. In Get Out, we get a great one of these right on page 41. Chris has sat down with his girlfriend's mother, Missy. She's kind of pressured him into doing hypnosis to solve his smoking habit, and it seems normal enough, if a little weird, until suddenly her empathetic expression twists into a sick smile, and she tells him to sink into the floor. And from his perspective, that is exactly what happens. He falls into this dark abyss, sees through his eyes like there's some kind of tiny window way above him, and he has no control over his body. It's a great, horrific moment. It's cinematic, it's unique, and it tells us that things are about to get a whole lot worse for our protagonist. After 2 more pages of this horror, Chris wakes up with no direct memory of what happened, but a general awareness that something's wrong. Things are not truly horrific yet, but we have a good idea of where they're headed. In Die Hard, John has been trying to get the attention of the authorities. On his first attempt, the firemen just turned around. Next, 911 was skeptical of his call, but they finally sent Sergeant Powell to check things out. And if you go to page 43, Powell has gone inside the building, talked to the terrorist who is posing as a security guard, and decided that things look okay. John watches as Powell goes back to his car and realizes he's about to lose his only lifeline to the authorities. So what does he do? Right on page 44, he drops a body on Powell's car. Powell floors the car in reverse, backing into a storefront, and it's this great big cinematic moment, and now the cops know what's going on. This raises the stakes for the terrorists, which raises the stakes for John. And while you'd think this would be a good thing for John, it ultimately makes things harder because the guy leading the charge for the cops is not on John's side at all, and he ends up creating more obstacles. In Little Miss Sunshine, once again, go to page 44. We know that Richard has created this intensive 9-step program about winning, and he's got his agent who's told him that he can sell it for big money. Richard has thrown everything into this. The family is strapped for cash, and as a result, he needs the program to sell. Well, on page 44, Richard gets on the phone with his agent, Stan Grossman, and he finds out that the program did not, in fact, sell. And when he tells his wife Cheryl this on page 45, she's furious and he's humiliated. And how does this raise the stakes for the story? Richard has already told Olive that there is no point in competing in Little Miss Sunshine if she can't win. And now, in addition to not wanting to be a hypocrite, her winning this is all the more important to him because it will at least allow him some way in which he can win too. So we've raised the stakes and we've caused our protagonist to take a new action which will carry us through those next 10 to 15 pages. Now we need to do this yet again, but we need to do it in a way that's much bigger. Many times, the midpoint is called the point of no return because things have changed so drastically that the protagonist can't go back. This reversal means that they must continue on their journey and press forward toward their goal, for better or for worse. As a quick aside, the midpoint is not usually in the exact middle of the movie. It's typically kind of close to the middle of the second act, but because the first act tends to be longer than the third, it's skewed a little bit. So for a script of about 100 to 110 pages, page 60 is often right about where this lands. Anyway, let's take a look at how these movies approach the midpoint. In Get Out, go to page 62. The Armitages are hosting a party at their place, and it's been pretty awkward for Chris. There's been a lot of subtle and not so subtle racism. He's getting asked about the black experience, and then Logan, or the guy formerly known as Andre, approaches him. Chris has already met him earlier, and he was super strange, and his friend Rod told him to go get a picture. So Chris tries to snap one in a way that's subtle, but the flash goes off, and it stuns Andre. And Andre's face shifts to one of horror, and on page 63, he tells Chris to get out, and then shouts at him to get the fuck out of there. It's a great, wild moment, and it affirms for Chris that this house is not okay. In Die Hard, go to page 72. This is a 125-page script, so unsurprisingly, our midpoint happens a little later. But as a friendly reminder, do not submit a 125-page script anywhere. It won't get read. Aim for 115 or shorter. Anyway, the cops got involved thanks to that stakes-raising pinch point, but they're not working with John or listening to him. They've tried to lay siege, and they've played right into what the terrorists want, and now the terrorists are firing at them. John needs a way to disrupt everything, so what does he do? He drops C4 down an elevator shaft and causes a massive explosion in the building. It's a huge action set piece that looks amazing on camera, and more importantly, it ups the ante in some major ways. First of all, the terrorists have shown the cops that they're in charge. Second, Robinson, who's in charge of the cops, now hates John more. Third, Hans is more out to get John than ever. And fourth, Ellis realizes the danger they're in, and he decides to tell Hans who John is. And all of this is really bad news for John. In Little Miss Sunshine, go right to page 60. Grandpa has died at the hospital. Richard is obviously upset, but also this is going to cause them to miss the pageant, and they've driven 700 miles to get to this point. Between his father dying and finding out that his dreams have been crushed, Richard has had two incredibly brutal things happen in the last 24 hours. He decides right then and there that they are not going to miss this pageant, and by page 62, they're stealing Grandpa's body and they're back on their way. And if Richard is willing to do that for Olive to get out there and win, we know that there's no way he's going back. Part of what often makes the midpoint the point of no return is that it changes the protagonist's relationship with the antagonistic force of the movie, which is why the obstacles tend to get bigger in the second half of Act 2. In Get Out, this moment with Andre makes it clear to Chris that something is really wrong, and just as importantly, it puts the Armitages off balance. The entire point of this party was for them to sell Chris to the highest bidder for an obscene amount of money, and if he leaves, they have a huge problem on their hands. Now they're going to be forced to act more decisively and more swiftly. In Die Hard, the midpoint not only results in Hans being more out to get John than ever, it results in Hans learning John's identity. In Little Miss Sunshine, just before Grandpa died, Olive told him how much she didn't want to disappoint her dad by losing. Grandpa gave her great advice, but now Grandpa's dead and her dad is more focused than ever on making sure she wins. And on that same note, because Richard has lost two very significant things, his stakes have also been heightened. In movies that center around a romance, the opposite romantic lead is often the antagonistic force, or at least one of those forces. In these situations, writers often refer to the midpoint as sex at 60. Watch nearly any romantic comedy and you will notice that the leads have sex at around 60 minutes in, or at the very least they have like a romantic kiss or something. This changes their relationship and it creates a point of no return. It's either going to go great or end badly, but they're not just going to forget about each other, certainly not with all the buildup that led to it. Finally, keeping that last point in mind, the midpoint is almost always a big genre moment. It's scary and unsettling in Get Out, it's explosive in Die Hard, and it's both hilarious and dramatic in Little Miss Sunshine. Once you've finished your midpoint, congratulations, you've just made it halfway through Act 2. But things are about to get even harder for your protagonist. So much so that you're going to bring them straight down to rock bottom because you're a writer and that means you torture characters for fun. These rock bottom low points often wind up between pages 70 and 80. In Get Out, on page 72, Chris discovers pictures of Rose with a bunch of other black boyfriends. She had told him that he was the first black guy she ever dated, and so instantly he realizes that there is something super wrong and that she is involved. His vanity has allowed him to be blind to this and love this completely fucked up woman, and now there's no denying it. He tries to leave, but by page 74, the family has trapped him inside. Dean gives him a speech about purpose in life and sacrifice, and we realize how unhinged and crazy he is, and then Missy taps her teacup, and on page 75, Chris finds himself in that black hole. He is screwed. In 3 pages, he's realized his girlfriend is psychotic, he's come face to face with his blindness to reality, and he's been sent to literal rock bottom, the sunken place. In Die Hard, in the pages since the midpoint, Ellis has given Hans John's name, and then Ellis himself got killed when he thought he could negotiate with Hans and get John to come in. Hans then told John that if he didn't come in, he was going to keep shooting. John, his feet now bleeding from broken glass, is trying to form some kind of plan. He starts reloading a magazine, talking to Powell as he does, and we learn about how Powell stopped working the street after he shot a kid. It feels like a dark moment already. And then the terrorists find John and they capture him on page 89. They take him up to the roof, they get their detonators, and John has blown it. Again, this moment plays a little later in Die Hard because it's longer than your typical spec script. Now that's just the script, but the movie actually takes things further and structures it a little differently. And I actually think it's better because it brings in more threads of theme and story to make that low point even lower, and that allows for a stronger emotional arc. In the movie, John ran into Hans upstairs, but he had no idea who he was. Hans pretended to be a hostage, and John pretended to buy it, even giving Hans a gun to help protect himself. But when Hans tried to shoot John with it, he found out quickly that it was unloaded and that John had outsmarted him. In the script, they had a very similar scene much earlier in the movie, but it was with another terrorist. And it was a fantastic decision to move it here and sub in Hans because it's a great moment where we feel like John's about to win right before we take him down a peg. And it also keeps us focused on that relationship between Hans and John. Anyway, Carl, another terrorist, shows up. He and Hans shoot out a bunch of glass windows, forcing John to run across them barefoot. John does escape, but he's hurt. We cut away quickly to learn that the reporters have now found out all sorts of information, John's job, his badge number, and most importantly, that his family lives right there in LA. And as an audience, we realize that this is not good because it opens Holly up to danger. Immediately after learning this, we see that the terrorists have managed to break through the first section of the vault, and Hans tells them that he's got a miracle that will take care of the rest. And then we see John drag himself into a bathroom, feet bleeding all to hell, pulling glass out of them. Now, after all these things have happened in just the space of a couple minutes, and John is in a bad, tight spot, we get that dialogue about Powell shooting the kid. And then, just to make things worse, after John tells Powell that he feels like shit, Powell says, well then this won't matter, we're not calling the shots anymore. And we learn that the feds are now in charge. No, John does not get taken hostage in this version, but because of how the moment is crafted, it hits harder emotionally. It's also a slow moment, and these are important even in high-octane action movies. It's a good thing when we get a chance to sit with these important character beats. And importantly, that revelation about the feds changes everything, creating another turning point that propels the movie forward. In Little Miss Sunshine, we get the low point right on schedule, but it's delivered in an interesting way using the strength of the ensemble. Grandpa has died and his body is literally in the back of their bus, but they've decided to press forward anyway. But then Dwayne, Olive's brother, finds out he's colorblind on page 71. On page 72, Frank, his uncle, tells him that means that he can't fly fighter jets. This is a dream that Dwayne cares about so desperately that he's taken a vow of silence until he succeeds. We watch him crumble as he gets the news, and Frank yells for Richard to pull over, and then on page 73, Dwayne gets out and we hear him yell the word fuck, and that's the first time that he's spoken the entire length of the movie. It's a super effective, brutal moment, but Richard, he's so intensely focused on this pageant that he barely feels it. Instead of giving his son time to process his loss, he taps his watch and nods to his wife like they gotta get going. And after a couple seconds, Cheryl prods Dwayne too. And then on page 74, Dwayne freaks out at everyone, telling them they're not his family, calling them all losers, and pointing out the things that make them exactly that. It's incredibly harsh and it's cutting, and it's exactly the thing that Richard is terrified of. Finally, in something that's like a small acknowledgement of his flaw, Richard asks Olive if she'll talk to Dwayne because he knows that they connect in a way that he and Dwayne do not. And on page 75, Olive does a simple thing and sits down next to her brother, putting her arm on his shoulder. And in a second, he gets up, apologizes for what he said, and they all get back in the van, but with a few less minutes on an already ticking clock. Again, you'll notice that this is a moment where the action slows down to really let us feel the brutality. These characters are coming to terms with their situations and their flaws, and in addition to that, it's usually followed by a beat that moves us forward. Also, there is usually some kind of death at this point, often literal, sometimes figurative, but in many movies, the literal death of a character leads us right to this rock bottom moment. It's an effective way to bring them down right before we build them up again. In these three examples, it's a little different. Chris goes into the sunken place, which is something of a death of himself since he no longer has control over his body. In Die Hard, the low point is punctuated by Powell's story of the death of the kid that he shot. And in Little Miss Sunshine, it's the death of Dwayne's dream that brings him to the point where he calls everybody losers. Okay, so you've been mean to your characters and they've hit rock bottom and they've come face to face with their flaw, but that's not good enough. Now you're going to use this moment to motivate them back to their feet. You're going to complete their arc and you're going to have them do some things. And this is what tends to happen at the plot point where we break into Act 3. Sometimes we refer to this moment as the Act 2 climax, and that definitely works in the sense that it's often the height of the dramatic and emotional tension at this point in the movie. And there are often big genre-related set pieces involved, but not always. Most importantly, this is about completing that arc and getting your protagonist ready for that final push into Act 3. Sometimes you move from the low point to this moment almost immediately. Sometimes it takes an entire sequence to get there. Either way is fine, but you do want this moment as you move into Act 3, and because third acts are often around 20 pages, we're probably hitting this mark around page 85. But again, these numbers are truly just guidelines. In Get Out, the break into Act 3 happens right out of the low point. Chris goes to that sunken place, and then we watch Rose and her family talk above his point of view from afar. They almost talk like he's not even there as they drag him into the basement where we have never been before. And this is intentional, by the way, and there was even a little setup in the beginning where Dean told Chris that there was mold in the basement. Even though we're spending most of the movie in the house, we're still getting the cinematic benefit of going to a new location, and that's pretty cool. It gives us a sense of forward progress. Before we see the basement, we cut to Chris's friend, Rod. Unable to get in touch with Chris, he decides to Google Andre since Chris told him that he saw him at the party. He sees that Andre has been missing for some time, and this makes him realize that things are bad, incredibly bad, and that his friend needs help. Also, even though this is a beat that's not directly related to our protagonist, it still feels active and appropriate. It was Chris's actions in taking a photo of Andre and sending it to Rod that resulted in Rod doing this. So Chris is going into the basement, Rod's coming to help him, and we know something is going down. In Die Hard, the movie and the script diverge pretty wildly here. I'm going to focus on the movie because that's what we referenced in previous classes, and I think they were important changes. John is hurt. He's at his low point, and Powell has just informed him that the FBI is in charge. That's a really bad thing because the FBI's protocol is to shut down the building's power, and this plays right into Han's plan, allowing them to get access to the final part of the vault. It also underscores how much smarter he is than the people who are trying to stop him. And the subtext of that is, if anyone's going to stop him, it's going to need to be John. Meanwhile, the movie teases out John's low point. John tells Powell how he never got to tell his wife how sorry he is, and he asks Powell to do that for him. His arc becomes complete here, and it's an emotionally tense moment. Powell tells John to make that apology himself. John says that's up to the man upstairs, and then something occurs to him. He saw Hans upstairs, and that doesn't make sense. He tells Powell to lay off for a while. He's going to go check on something. There is a shift in terms of John's goal here. His initial approach was to hold out until the authorities could help, but they've proven useless. So John gets up and heads after Hans, and we move into Act 3. In Little Miss Sunshine, we get a very climactic end to Act 2 as the family is running a couple minutes late for the pageant's hard deadline for registration. They're driving over medians, they're whipping through parking lots, they're crashing through gates. They get to the pageant and they find that they're 4 minutes late and that the pageant official won't sign them up. This is crushing for everyone involved, and it's especially bad for Richard and Olive, who have so much riding on this. But then a guy who's assisting offers to sign them in, and on page 81, there's a moment of relief, and we are ready to move into Act 3, the pageant. The completion of Richard's and Olive's arcs does not perfectly coincide with this moment, and as always, there are multiple ways to tell a story. Olive's arc comes pretty close though, and as we spoke about a couple weeks ago, there's a very good reason for holding back on Richard's. With Olive, just as she gets signed in on page 81, she sees Miss Florida and wants to go meet her. On page 85, she asks Miss Florida if she eats ice cream because her dad told her that pageant winners probably don't eat much of it. Olive is elated to learn that Miss Florida does in fact eat ice cream, and it's the moment where she realizes that she can be who she wants to be. With Richard, because he's kind of the thematic antagonist of the movie, he needs to remain flawed right up till the end. But most often, we do see the near completion of our characters' arcs at the end of Act 2, or at the very least, an acceptance of their flaws. This point propels us toward the third act and the ending, and just like in these three examples, it can be great if there's a notable location change. This gives the movie that feeling of forward momentum, and it suggests that there will be an outcome one way or another. There's also often a scene or a few beats where the protagonist preps for the final showdown as we move from Act 2 to Act 3, so watch for those moments as well. Okay, so you've got your 4 plot points for the second act, but what are plot points other than joints that just hold large sections of the movie together? What do you do with the pages in between? Well, they definitely shouldn't feel like filler. That's how you lose a reader and an audience quickly. Remember how way early on in this class we spoke about the importance of active characters, especially your protagonist and antagonist. One of the best things that you can do to make all of these pages between your plot points feel energetic is to think of them as their own mini movies with their own mini goals. Or, as we often like to call them, sequences. And as the characters face progressive obstacles and take action to overcome them, these flow into those plot points. I'll use Little Miss Sunshine as an example. So as a quick recap, on page 26, after telling Olive there's no point in competing if she can't win, Richard announces, "We're going to Florida," and that's our break into Act 2. On page 44, Richard gets the news that Stan Grossman was unable to sell his 9-step winning program, and he's humiliated in front of his wife and family. That is our stakes-raising pinch point. On page 60, Grandpa has died at the hospital, and at that midpoint on page 62, Richard has them steal his body so that they can get back in the van and make it to the pageant on time. On page 74, we reach the low point. Dwayne has found out that he's colorblind and that his dream of being a fighter pilot is unachievable, and he tells his family they're a bunch of losers. On page 81, they've made it to the pageant, and a guy takes pity on them and signs them in, and that's our break into Act 3. All of these plot points raise the stakes and propel the movie toward its ending. You might also notice that the number of pages between the plot points grows a little smaller each time. That's pretty common. It's a subtle way of accelerating pace and increasing momentum. The first stretch from where we break into Act 2 to our stakes-raising page 45 beat is kind of our introduction to the second act. We get our bearings here. Obstacles are introduced. but everything still feels pretty light and fun, like our protagonist is going to be able to deal with it. And as a result, it seems like they'll be able to achieve their goal while still living according to the anti-theme, just like they were in the first act. In Little Miss Sunshine, these pages are largely about Richard trying to keep his family on track as they begin their road trip. Grandpa's kind of this wild, vulgar pain in the ass here, but Richard can deal with that. They get to a diner and he's trying to keep Olive in the mindset of a pageant winner, telling her not to eat ice cream. His family works against him here, but to some degree, he still feels like he's made his point. And then the clutch on their bus goes, but Richard's a winner. He's not going to let that derail them. He finds out that they can start their van in third gear as long as they keep it above 15 miles an hour, and this leads to them push starting it for the rest of the entire movie. And yes, that's an obstacle, but it's also fun and it's easy enough to overcome. So how does that flow into the stakes-raising moment where Richard finds out that his program isn't gonna sell? Well, after figuring out that they can make things work by push starting the van, Richard's feeling good. He starts bragging to Frank about his 9-step program, which is sure to sell and change their lives forever. Frank gives him a little shit about it, and Richard tells him how sarcasm is the refuge of losers, doubling down on that ideal. And that is when Richard gets that call from Stan Grossman, the call that he's been waiting on since the movie started. That is when he finds out that his program isn't going to sell, and he's humiliated in front of his family. And that moment does not come until Richard's feeling great and self-assured to the point where he's actually bragging. Because of that setup, the moment hits that much harder. So we've given Richard a bit of a gut punch and we've also raised the stakes. Now we need to get Richard, Olive, and the family from that point to the midpoint. The overall goal has not disappeared. They still need to get to the pageant on time. But Richard has something else on his mind now. He has just been humiliated. This is a guy who's all about winning and he's been made to appear a loser. And if he's going to use this opportunity to show his daughter and family how important winning is, he cannot just let that stand. So this sequence is largely going to revolve around that. Michael Arndt, the screenwriter, starts with a really brilliant moment right out of the gate. As a result of the news that Richard gets, the tension is really high and he just wants to get on the road to forget about it. And so he hurries everyone along and they wind up leaving Olive at a gas station. They realize this almost immediately and circle back to pick her up, forcing her to run aside their messed up van so that they won't have to start it again. And it's a great moment of levity after this super dramatic moment, and it lets us catch our breath as we move forward. It can be a great move to mix things up in terms of emotion and pacing as you begin a new sequence. Like I said, it helps us catch our breath a bit, but this moment also does something important in terms of theme, and in terms of Richard's arc. It highlights that right now, his own shit is just taking precedence over his daughter to the point where he's forgotten her at a gas station, despite her being the very daughter he's driving 800 miles to a beauty pageant. And this matters because this sequence is going to test his relationship to that theme and to his character flaw of putting winning above everything. Right after they pick up Olive again, his father, Grandpa, tells Richard that he's proud of him for at least trying to do something big. It's a beat that exposes Richard to the theme directly, and despite his own flaws, it makes Grandpa something of a mentor figure. Richard tries to dismiss this, but Grandpa won't let it go, and Richard ends up shaking hands with him. Even if it's small, we can see this means something to him, and it's the very first crack in that armor. Later on, when they get to the motel, Olive tells Grandpa she's scared about the pageant because she doesn't want to let Richard down. Grandpa tells Olive that she's a winner simply because she's willing to try, regardless of whether she technically wins or loses. Olive is comforted by this, and once again, the movie's theme is demonstrated. But also at the motel, Richard and Cheryl have a fight because Cheryl trusted Richard's conviction that the program would sell. As a family, they bet a lot on it. They're in dire straits financially, and Cheryl has no idea what they're going to do, and she tells Richard she never wants to hear about the 9 steps again. And that does it. Richard decides to fix things, but the VW bus won't work without other people to push it, so instead he pays a teen for a moped, which keeps a thread of humor running alongside that emotion, and he hops on and rides it all the way to another hotel where he's able to confront Stan Grossman. He finds Stan and he demands to know what happened, he demands to know what the problem was, and Stan tells him the uncomfortable truth. He tells Richard that he is the problem. Stan can't sell Richard. And it's over. It's brutal, and Richard has to ride home on that moped, and then the next morning, when he's barely had any sleep, Olive shows up at his bedside. Grandpa won't wake up. It turns out he's OD'd. And then it just gets worse. At the hospital, as they're waiting for news on Grandpa, Cheryl calls a family meeting. She tells everyone that because of what's happened with Richard's program, they may have to declare bankruptcy and sell their house and move, and she reminds them that they still have each other, and that's what's important, and then she breaks down and starts to cry. This is a low moment for Richard. We've got him to nearly rock bottom already, but this sequence isn't over yet. First, Grandpa has to die. And as Richard finds out about all the post-mortem paperwork he needs to do, he realizes they're not going to make the pageant on time. And that can't be allowed to happen. Not after he's been humiliated like this. He must show Olive what it means to be a winner, and he's going to get her there one way or another. And so they steal Grandpa's body. Okay, so a quick check-in here. Richard is doing well, living life according to the anti-theme before that stakes-raising pinch point happens. Then, thanks to his dad's kind words, he kind of flirts with the idea that maybe winning isn't everything. And then Grandpa shares those ideas with Olive as well. And then Stan Grossman forces Richard to confront the fact that maybe he is a loser, and he's gonna have to deal with that somehow. But after Grandpa dies and he realizes how much he's let his family down, Richard is driven back to the only thing he knows, the importance of being a winner. And one way or another, he's going to express that by helping his daughter win. So now it's after the midpoint and they are back on the road with Grandpa's body in the back. We're in the second half of Act 2 and the overall goal is the same, but this new sequence has an added element to it. We learn that they have to be at the pageant in only 3.5 hours and they still have to cover 200 miles. It is gonna be close. And now that we've got this intense ticking clock, we're gonna increase the drama by throwing some obstacles their way. In his impatience, Richard blares the horn at somebody. And then the horn just keeps on honking automatically, it won't stop. And because of this, a cop pulls them over. That's already an obstacle because it eats into their time, but it's way worse because there's a dead body in the back. And because Richard is acting suspicious, the cop demands to look in the trunk. It's a tense moment, but thankfully Grandpa's porn distracts him and the family gets away. But they've lost precious minutes and now the tension's even higher. And with that tension now super high, it is the perfect time for Dwayne to discover that he's colorblind thanks to an eye test that Olive found at the hospital. And now this guy who took a vow of silence, who Richard praised for doing it because it demonstrated his commitment to winning, is going to speak for the first time. And he's going to do it by dropping an F-bomb and bring us into our low point where Richard pulls over and Dwayne mourns the loss of his dream. Richard wants to get going because even now he's unable to put his own goals aside in order to empathize with his son, and that's when Dwayne calls him and the rest of the family losers. Richard's greatest fear has been realized. His own son thinks he's a loser, and we have officially hit the low point. Somehow, though, we have got to get to Act 3. So the next sequence is going to be exactly about that, getting us ready for the third act. Stakes are higher than they've ever been, and there's a philosophical change that is beginning to take place. Specifically in this movie, that change is playing out in a slightly unique way because of that kind of dual protagonistship that Olive and Richard have. But it's still playing out. Richard recognized the power of being there for each other enough that he prompted Olive to go talk to Dwayne, but he also did that because he knew it was the only thing that would get them back on the road. And now that they are on the road, they're behind schedule, and as a unit, they all want this. Dwayne didn't even want to come, but now he's also lost something, and he truly wants this for Olive. Even though they all have a little more to learn, for the first time, it truly feels like they're in this together. But they are behind schedule. There is a very real chance of them not making it. That will have made this entire journey and everything that went along with it worthless. Richard is not about to let that happen. As they argue over how to get there, he takes service roads, careens across multiple lanes and parking lots, and drives straight over medians, losing a tire in the process. They pull into the parking lot and rush inside 4 minutes too late, leading to an argument with that pageant official before the assistant finally lets them in and into Act 3. At the end of the day, if you're feeling stuck in Act 2, look at the following 3 things. First, how active is your protagonist? Ask this about your antagonist too. Make sure that they are taking active action in order to achieve their goals in a way that's in line with their emotional states. Next, ask yourself if you've put enough obstacles in their way. If you haven't, maybe there's room for a subplot that will directly impact the story and their arc. Richard's whole 9 Steps program and the thing with Stan Grossman, that's a subplot. But it is so integral to his character and to his arc that it's easy to forget that. But it gives him a lot to do, and it raises the stakes for him. And that's the final thing. Ask yourself if you're increasing the stakes enough. All that means is that you are raising the meaning of their success or the consequences of their failure, or both. When the second act started for Richard, it was just about him getting his daughter to a pageant and teaching her a lesson about winning. By the time the second act ends, his marriage, his relationship with his kids, and his entire sense of self-worth feel like they hinge on the outcome of this thing. Because of the structure of this course, you've probably already passed some of these points in your own scripts, and you might feel inspired to go back and change things. That's normal. I have never written a first draft that didn't need major revisions. Like I've been saying all along, our first ideas are rarely our best, and the only thing that matters is the end result. But don't make those changes unless you're also getting your weekly pages in. Get this draft done first. If you need to, jot down notes about what you want to change, but know that there will be lots of time for that later. And we'll talk all about rewriting a couple weeks from now. Before we get into this week's assignments, remember, this course is not free. You are paying yourself and investing in yourself, so do the work and don't skip assignments. And if you want to pick up the t-shirt or mug that are exclusive to this course, you got to earn that right by finishing. But also, much more importantly, this is about giving you the best foundation possible. The other cost of this course is to pay it forward. If you're getting something out of it, which I definitely think you are if you haven't quit by now, share it with others. And hit the like button, and please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have questions, leave a comment. I'll answer some of them right here, and I'll likely use others for future videos. Okay, assignments for week 12. 1. Keep up with those pages. Write 10 to 15 of them to ensure you finish on time. 2. Think about movies you know with super active protagonists, especially in the second act. Find a script for one of those and read it, paying attention to the actions they take and the decisions they make in order to achieve their goal. And then jot down a list of those actions in your journals. And that's it.